Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. This show is brought to you in partnership with the Witherslack Group, experts in special education and care, and John Catt Educational, leading publishers of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at schools in the UK and beyond. Enjoy the podcast. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio with me, Tom Rogers, and we have a very exciting show for you this evening, as always. But we've got Daisy Christodolou and Kalil joining us in just a moment to talk all things the future of education on the planet Earth. I suppose the United Kingdom a little bit more, but basically everybody. Global future of education we're going to be discussing tonight. Really excited to sort of do this double header. Yesterday I had Tom Sherrington on, and we were talking about similar issues and topics, although we went off on a massive tangent. We'll probably do that again tonight, I would have thought. The football is more or less done. It's 3-0 to Brazil. There's nothing to play for there. So perfect timing to come and listen to this show with us. I'm just going to request both Kalil and Daisy into the show. Just before we get cracking with that, a couple of our sponsors that I'd like to talk about first. We've got John Catt Education, who are a leading provider of education publications for the teaching profession. If you want to find out what they've got on offer at the moment, go to johncattbookshop.com and have a look on the homepage at the titles, and they've got some really special deals at the moment for Christmas where you can get some books at a special discount price. And our other sponsor, who is pinned to the space at the top, is Witherslack Group. And again, if you're interested in what they have to offer, which includes lots of free webinars, which are free to sign up for, then you can have a look at the pinned tweet that is in the space at the top if you're listening live. If you're listening back, visit witherslackgroup.co.uk. And if you want to find out about their career opportunities, perhaps you're considering a change of school, then go to witherslackgroup.co.uk/careers to find out more about the different careers they have on offer. Now, the theme tonight is all about the future of education, the past, the present, the future, and what better guests to discuss this with. Daisy, I hope you can hear me. If you want to unmute yourself. Good evening.
I can hear you, Tom. Hi, Tom. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining me this evening. Really appreciate you giving up a bit of time to talk about this.
No problem.
And I thought, I will give a really short introduction for you, and then maybe you can fill in the gaps after that.
Sure, sounds good.
So, Daisy, you are a former maths teacher.
No, not English.
Oh, sorry. English. Oh, my goodness.
No,
that's
fine.
the most appalling thing to say to anyone who teaches.
No, that's cool.
Former English teacher who also you have been a proponent of, in inverted commas, no more marking. Would that be sort of?
Yeah, I work for no more marking.
Yeah, but I mean, as a concept, as a sort of
Yes, definitely. We do comparative judgment, and that's the thing we do.
Yeah,
so,
for sure. And also you, I guess, you've got your myths of education. You've got, would you call yourself a serial author?
I've written 3 books.
Yeah, I think that qualifies.
Yeah, if that counts as a serial, then yes.
I think that qualifies. And also, you were the team. Now, again, correct me if I'm wrong. The team captain and you won University Challenge.
That's right. Yeah, that's all correct.
That is exciting. Did you not feel the pressure though on University Challenge?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, for sure.
I mean,
you think you're gonna look like a mug on national TV.
But I think with Paxman in particular, he is quite intimidating, compared to other quiz people.
He is. Yeah.
Oh man, that's
it was quite nerve-wracking. Yeah.
And you basically came across in that program as a genius. which is difficult to do on University Challenge when you're surrounded by other geniuses. So that's a short introduction for you. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to before we talk to you, Daisy, I'm going to introduce our other guest, Kalil
Great.
Rouse. Kalil, do you want to unmute yourself?
Evening, Tom.
Now, I'm going to start with the most significant thing about you. You're a former Teachers Talk radio host.
Yeah, and problem is, you've just given Daisy the longest introduction of anyone I've ever heard.
Are you saying you didn't win University Challenge, Kalil?
I didn't. No, I applied, and they didn't let me on the show.
But Kalil, do give us a proper introduction to yourself so people know who they're listening to tonight.
Yeah, so my name is Kalil Rouse. I used to be a Teacher Talk radio host, doing a lot of things to do with pastoral CPD. I'm currently a teacher of maths, a senior leader in a secondary school overseeing safeguarding and mental health and well-being. I've been teaching for what now? About 11 years or so. So consider myself fairly experienced, and just happy to be partially back on the Teacher Talk radio airwaves.
Yes.
Talking with yourself, mate.
Yes. And thank you very much for joining in with this. Daisy, I want to start. Let's get right into this.
Go for it.
Because the whole thing tonight, the whole premise is sort of future of education. But there's a lot of things that could obviously fall under that blanket, if you like. So the first thing I want to talk about is assessment. And
go for it.
The first thing I want to ask you about is measuring progress really possible in schools?
Yes, I think it is. So that doesn't mean to say that you can measure progress perfectly or that it's absolutely precise, but it definitely is. And obviously, I suppose people have different definitions of progress. I wouldn't get too kind of complicated about it. I do think, if a student is attaining at one point at the start of the school and then you measure their attainment again at the end, you can see how they've done as an individual. And then in terms of a school, you can obviously aggregate up all the students in a school. So I do think it's possible. So my straight answer is yes. But I am also aware, being in this world, that there are a lot of quite tricky technical issues that come with it. And there's a lot of tricky technical issues that can cause big problems and are not necessarily well understood. And you assumed I was a math teacher at the start. I'm not. I'm an English student. So I've had to learn a lot of those as I've gone along. And they are tricky. And they are technical issues. And there's some issues around measuring progress which are quite counterintuitive. And I think so I think people maybe think it's simpler than it is. Yeah. But I don't want to go to the other extreme and say that it's so complex it's impossible. I wouldn't want to say that either. So I think it is possible if we do it right and we're careful about it.
Let's take English as an example, as a subject, as an example for a minute. If you were to say one measure of measuring progress that was reasonably good versus one that was reasonably bad, which measures would you think of?
Well, what we do at No More Marking, we do comparative judgment of writing. And so we will measure progress over time. So at primary, for example, we do one assessment per year group per year. And I was just a couple of hours ago on a webinar with some of our schools, and there's a couple of our schools who've been working with us for 5 years. So they've got 5 years worth of data. So that I was just talking to them about their current year 5 assessment. And there's some of our schools who have been assessing that cohort of year 5 since they were in year 1. Now, we've got numbers and data where we can say the average scaled score of that year 1 cohort in year 1, that year 5 cohort when they were in year 1 was kind of, about 480. And now the average is about 550. So I can put a numerical value on that and say across these 40 odd kids in this particular school, across 5 years, for 4 years, 5 assessment points, their writing assessment is improved, numerically. What I can also do with comparative judgment is show you the actual underlying pieces of writing. And that is, I think, incredibly powerful when you actually say, let's look at a piece of writing that this student produced when they were in year 1. And, the typical year 1 piece, I was a secondary English teacher, so I always, when I see year 1 pieces of writing, I've never known so many possible spellings of once upon a time. And they all spell once upon a time, kind of WUNS, like very phonetically. So you look at a year one piece of writing and you've got a student writing once upon a time this happened and this happened and this happened, and you look at a year five piece of writing and it's kind of way more mature and sophisticated in the vocab and the sentence structure. It's obvious that students made progress, right? That's huge.
Yeah.
So that for me is a classic example of you obviously can measure progress, and with the naked eye someone who's not a teacher could look at the year one piece and look at the year five piece and go, yes, progress. Obviously, as I say, where it then gets more complicated is, what about if we want to measure progress over 6 months, not over 4 years? What about if we're looking at things where actually we think, I'm not sure that is progress? And the other interesting thing is, well, look, every student, probably even if they never went to school, would make some form of progress between year one and year five. The interesting thing then is, well, what is, typical progress? So I'm saying this student's gone from, once upon a time to, much more sophisticated, mature. But what if actually most students do even better than that? So that's where you get these kind of more difficult questions. But if you want a good example of measuring progress, I think what we do is statistically and in terms of psychometrics, very robust. I think it's also very useful for teachers because they get to see the actual quality of writing underneath it. So I'm biased obviously, but I would say that's a great example of measuring progress well. As I say, I think some of the areas where I think that's less you have more issues. I think there's issues when you're measuring over very short periods of time, because I think you just pick up noise.
Isn't that typically what schools do?
Yes, yeah, no, and I've talked about this. So again, what I talk about a lot is the difference between formative and summative assessment. And my point is that summative assessment, you want to leave quite a bit of time, because summative assessments are of big, complex skills. So that's why I'm saying, at primary, we assess once every year. And a lot of our schools, they say, but it's not enough, we want more. and they say, why aren't you measuring progress? We are measuring progress. We're just measuring over a longer time span.
Yeah.
Because, and the analogy I always use here is marathon running, right? So say you were starting out running a marathon. Would you run a marathon every day and think, right, if I get faster, if I run a marathon on Monday and I run one on Tuesday, if my marathon on a Tuesday is faster than my one on Monday, I'm getting better. You wouldn't do that. It's mad. Nobody runs 2 marathons.
No.
Well, some people do. You wouldn't expect that's the only way you can measure your progress. So I always say that complex skills like writing, like reading, like maths, problem solving, you take time to improve on them. So you don't want to be assessing too frequently. But that is not me then saying that that's summative assessment. I do think you can do formative assessments more frequently. I think you can do formative assessments every few seconds. Every question you ask is a formative assessment. But you can't then formative assessment, you measure it very differently. You can't measure it with a grade or a scaled score or a fraction of a grade or a scaled score. So again, my marathon analogy, I often say if you're training to run a marathon, you might go to the gym and do some yoga, right? And you might measure the amount of time you can hold a yoga pose for. And maybe you can hold it for 5 seconds one day and you can hold it for 10 seconds the next day. Now that's my equivalent of formative progress, right? But you can't, and that will make you in the long run a better marathon runner, but you can't measure it in terms of a marathon time. And that's what I would say, when it comes to writing, we know from all the assessments we do that vocabulary is an enormous factor in improving your reading, improving your writing, in fact, improving all subjects. Okay, there's a big correlation between a bigger vocabulary size and doing well in all subjects. But suppose in a lesson you teach a student a new word, that's my equivalent of a yoga pose you can hold for 5 seconds longer.
Yep.
That is genuine progress. There's a word that student didn't know and now they know it. But you can't measure that progress with a fraction of a grade or with a grade. In the same way you can't measure the yoga pose as a marathon time, right?
Yeah.
So my whole kind of philosophy is we need to separate out formative and summative assessment and formative and summative progress. Summative progress, you've got to accept you're going to do it over longer timescales. And formative, that's something you can be doing much more frequently, but it's not something where you can be necessarily getting this kind of standardized data in the way that you do with
So what you're basically saying is a big summative assessment is a more reliable or a better measure of measuring progress than a lot of formative assessment points within a term.
Yeah, so I think it's what I would distinguish between formative and summative progress, as well as I'd distinguish between
Right.
formative and summative assessment. So as I say, I think you probably can measure formative progress in every lesson. So if we take just that really simple example of vocabulary,
Yeah.
I know it's one thing, but let's
But then
imagine
the students might forget it though.
that is true. That is true, and that's why I'd always say, therefore, you've got to set up a curriculum where you are, you're not just taking kind of them learning that word at the end of one lesson as being it. So
Because I think that was one of
yeah,
the sort of
yeah,
criticisms of maybe the inspectorate, for example,
yeah.
in a few years ago was.
I do agree with that. I do agree with that. And
Was
I
that
think,
sort of measuring of that?
yeah,
There was that idea of measuring progress in a 10-minute chunk of in a
do
learning walk.
I do agree with that. I mean, my bigger beef with what that used to happen there was people expecting it to be measured as a grade,
Yeah.
But I also agree with you. There is an issue. So I would say there's two issues with that model. One was people were expecting to kind of grade every 10 minutes. And
Yeah.
that's not what grades are. That's the equivalent, I would say, of running a marathon every day, right? The other problem is, as you say, there is an issue around even if you learn a new word, for example, you can, in fact, you probably will. Well, from what we know about learning, you'll forget it quite quickly. So, you've got to also therefore have a curriculum that is reinforcing and embedding.
Yeah.
But I still don't think that's an argument. I think that second thing about the long-term learning, I'm very big on the long-term learning, and I think it's absolutely the case that all this stuff about the forgetting curve, we forget things so quickly. So I think that is enormously important, but I don't think that is an argument against testing and measuring progress in real time. I think it's just you've got to accept that you need to be testing and measuring progress like a lot in that formative sense. So if we go back to that vocab example, let's just take a really basic example. I know I'm being quite reductive here just to give examples. But let's say, you want your students, there's kind of 50 words, new words that you want them to learn across a half term or term. Okay. And you've broken those down into a couple per lesson, and you teach one in a lesson, and you spend quite a bit of time in it. At the end of it, at the start, the students don't know what that word means. And at the end, they can use it in a sentence. Now, you're absolutely right. There's a very good chance that the next lesson, they will have forgotten what that word means. But this is the other interesting thing. They're not in the position that they were, that they've gone back to exactly where they were when they didn't know that word at all. So that their knowledge of the word might have decayed, it might have faded a little bit, but when they come to relearn it, it will be quicker to pick it up again.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you do a couple of rounds of that, they will, get the word into long-term memory. And the other thing is that the very act of you testing them, this is where it's quite nice, the very act of them recalling that word from long-term memory, that will actually help them to consolidate their knowledge of that word and to learn that word. So the act of doing the testing and the recalling is going to help them with the long-term learning.
Yeah.
So all those things, I think, that's a great example of how you can measure progress, and even better, how the act of measuring progress will help the students make progress.
Got you. Kalil, in a school, because obviously you're still teaching your heart away,
Indeed.
what I mean, the original question was, is measuring progress really possible in school? So you might want to have your sort of take on that. But the other thing I wanted to ask you is, how do you measure progress in your school and in your class?
Yeah, so well, in my class, you don't do it. If they've learned something from what they didn't know when they walked in the room, they have made progress. Does that mean they've now got it into a long-term memory? No. Does that mean they're gonna know it forevermore? No.
Yeah.
That is very difficult to measure apart from the formative way, where you just kind of look at who's picking it up and who's not picking it up. School-wide though, we use age-related grades. So kids from all year groups, so we'll talk about year 9 is a good example. If they're in year 9, then end of the year, we essentially grade them from year 7 roughly. We give them grades of 1 to 9. But then these are all relative to their cohort, and also it goes wider as to relative to the whole academy trust, essentially, the multi-academy trust that we've got. So in maths, English, and science, they can just get a grade, which then gives their relative grade compared to everyone else. So then, essentially, if you got a grade 4 at the end of year 7, and then by the time you got to year 8, you're still a grade 4, you've actually made progress, because it means that everyone's moved. You would assume that everyone's moved up and you've kept in the same position relatively. So you've actually accumulated more, either whether it's knowledge or skill. You haven't like made above expected progress, but you've kind of just continued in your relative position, because if you hadn't made progress and gone, or if you'd receded, then your relative grade would go backwards. And we use that model in our school at the moment. So we have assessments that they take in maths, English, and science that thousands of kids take, and we generate the grade boundary. Well, the academy generates the grade boundaries, and then we just track that. So what you're looking for is, as a minimum, the child stays roughly getting the same grade the whole time in those maths, English, and science as it moves with their cohort, because the assumption is that everyone just gets better because you learn and accumulate more. And then if your relative position has stayed the same, it doesn't mean you haven't made progress. It just means you haven't made above. You haven't like gone above and beyond. You get what I mean? So that's what we do in our school at the moment.
That's interesting. Daisy, have you ever heard of anything like that?
I have. Yeah. So I think for summative assessment, that is a consistent way of assessing that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I think what you've got to realise, it goes back to what I was saying before. Let's bring it back to like a piece of writing. Let's make it concrete. Yeah. Let's go back to that year 1 kid who's writing Once Upon a Time, and the year 5 kid, 4 years on, who's now writing, really amazing, grown-up, fluent piece of writing. Your big question is, that kid's obviously made progress, right? Obviously they have. But, you do kind of want to know, have they made typical progress? Is that you do want to know, like, is that expected? And also what you want to know is if they started out kind of really behind. So if you've got a kid who was coming in at year 1 and actually they weren't writing at all, they weren't even writing Once Upon a Time, they just couldn't write. Maybe in year 5 they're still kind of not writing that well, but given where they were, they've done pretty well. So you do need to have some idea of kind of what is typical, what is expected. And I know sometimes people kind of when it comes to sort of an assessment model that requires an element of kind of comparison, I know that people sometimes feel that's that's not great, and that's bad, because it should be about what you know and you can do. But I think that element of, in order to know what expected or typical is, you have to have some idea of what is typical for a cohort, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely think what Kalil's outlined, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
As a summative metric, and I would say, obviously, what I'd also say is, that is also something where it's a summative metric. You're not going to improve on it incredibly rapidly, and so you want something formative alongside it where you can get that kind of more rapid progress. So, but yeah, that totally makes sense to me.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
This episode of Teachers Talk Radio has been made possible with support from Witherslack Group, the UK's leading provider of SEN education and care. They're here to support you too through an ever-growing offer of free resources, including webinars, podcasts, articles, and events aimed at supporting teaching professionals like you. Visit their website at www.witherslackgroup.co.uk to find out more.
There are those who say that we have become far too obsessed with the idea of students making rapid progress in it's progress. It's assess, grade, progress. How much progress have they made? Let's measure the progress. Let's look at what we're going to do next to get them to make more progress. So my next sort of topic, which I want to ask you both, and I'll start with you, Daisy, is about the future of assessment in schools. So particularly thinking about the recent report that came out from Labour, where I say came out from Labour, it was from David Blunkett, but it was recommended, it was commissioned by Labour, where they advocated quite radical reforms actually to assessment in terms of, and there are many campaigns that advocate for much less formal assessment than we have now. There are others who want a portfolio-based assessment system where students, almost like coursework in a way, but not coursework. It's almost like a collection of things they've done, which are then assessed rather than sitting formal exams. Whereas there are others who are very much in the camp of, we need to carry on as we are. We need our GCSEs. We need our A levels. We need even our ASs. We need lots of formal set piece exams, and we need formal assessments in between of, if you like, in a traditional academic sense. You sit in an exam hall and you write a paper. Where do you sit on this?
So, lots of important issues there. So where I sit on it is I think we do need assessment reform, but probably most of those things that were in that Labour report, I'm probably not that keen on. Maybe there were one or two that I didn't mind the idea of, but most of them I felt would not be helpful. I do think it's really important so it goes back to the kind of summative assessment point. I do think it's a problem when you overdo the summative assessment. I'll go back to that marathon analogy. It is a problem if you've got a situation, and I've been in situations in schools where it's been like that, where you are kind of setting past papers every 15 minutes. That is a problem, right? So I understand why people think, we're too governed by exams and the exam dictates everything, and that's a problem. I get why people think that, right? But for me, the solution is not to get rid of exams. I think exams are really important. And when I say exams, externally marked assessments, where a student is completing work independently in standardized conditions. And the reason I think standardization is an important word here. And I think standardization is a word that sometimes, gets a bad press. It sounds a bit nasty. It sounds a bit like maybe a factory model where we're forcing all kids into a straitjacket. The flip side of that, though, you can look at it another way, where we're kind of, one way you can say, we're forcing all kids into a straitjacket. The other way you can say, well, every kid's got a level playing field. Every kid's got the same circumstances and the same kind of, platform that they're operating from. And you can say in another way that it's a basis of equality. And my big problem with a lot of the portfolio and coursework assessment is they introduce a lot of grey areas, which typically get exploited by parents and students who are more advantaged. And that is a reality of every system where this has been tried. And I think this is one of the things that is less understood and poorly understood about standardized exams. People think standardized exams are really bad for poor kids. They're really bad for disadvantaged kids. The reality is the opposite. The reality is that disadvantaged kids do better on exams than they do on coursework. The reality is that kids with kind of, behavioural issues or SEN or, low attaining kids, they do better on exams than they do on coursework and teacher assessment.
But is that because an exam in itself is quite it's not a very creative endeavour, let's say. Obviously you might have exams where they go into a room and they create something for 3 hours and it's assessed. But generally speaking, our exam system is quite focused on knowing things and putting them onto a piece of paper, recalling.
Well, I disagree with that, and I think creativity is one of these. It's one of these more complicated issues. What is creativity? So creativity, I would keep it simple, a basic definition. It's something new and original. Something originally useful. And there is in order to be creative, you need a grounding of knowledge, and you need kind of a grounding. You need to be able to recall and to know things fluently. So the idea that knowing things and recall is in opposition to creativity, I would reject.
Yeah.
And then in terms of are exams creative or not, again, they certainly can be. They certainly, there's no reason why. And again, I think sometimes maybe we're in this mindset where we think, well, creativity has to be, I don't know, constructing this incredible portfolio of whatever. Or why is answering a complicated maths problem not creative? Why is writing a story in an exam conditions, why is that not creative? So I and those are all things that are on the current exam system. So I think we've got to be wary of saying the current exam system, there is no creativity in it. I would say that that's not true. I think in lots of ways, I mean, literally, I remember a lot of what I did as an English teacher was teaching kids creative writing because it was a major part of the exam. So I don't think our exam system, I wouldn't say it's all about recall. And that's all it's about.
I mean, I'm not saying it's all about recall. I think there is that argument that there is a set of things that one needs to know, and then they are tested on it in a very short sort of snapshot way, and that therefore is unfair on, regardless of the student's
background.
Is that
unfair? Why is that unfair?
Only unfair on certain students who are not. Are perhaps not equipped well in terms of remembering things, in terms of dealing with pressure, in terms of revising. I mean, some students are disadvantaged in the sense they don't know how to revise, whereas others do. And revising in itself is not necessarily... yes, it is a skill.
So I think those are more serious objections, and I do have sympathy for that. So I said it's an equal level playing field, and I think that's true. I think exams are a level playing field, but you are absolutely right to point out that students do not, in their schooling, unfortunately, have a level playing field, and in terms of their home lives and their backgrounds. So you're absolutely right. Some students have quiet places to revise and blah blah blah, blah and help and what have you. Other students don't. My point would be that coursework and portfolios are just going to exaggerate those differences even more. So the idea that coursework and portfolios are a solution to that, they're not. What is the solution to that? The solution to that is great teaching. The solution to that is getting every kid to know how to revise. The solution to that is, I guess, breakfast and after school clubs. So, there are solutions to that. They're not coursework and portfolios.
Kalil, do you want to come in?
I was going to say, but there's surely there's a middle ground where you can have assessments that, I hate using the word assess again, but assessments that assess a child's proficiency in a certain skill without requiring them to have rote learned or committed a lot of facts or information to memory, reliant on that. So I think what Tommy was, I kind of agree with you on that, Tom, because if you think about subjects, so I can say, for example, that when I was growing up, I had a good memory. But I was in lessons with people that didn't have, for whatever reason, I had a better memory than other people. So then that just meant when it came to subjects like history, when not the whole skill, but one part of being able to get marks was being able to recall specific dates of when things happened. That doesn't make me any more capable or smart than someone who doesn't remember the date of the Wall Street crash, for example. But I was just able to do so because my memory was equipped in a certain way. But what I'm saying is, I don't think, so you've got on one side, you've got assessments that rely somewhat on recall, somewhat not. And I agree that it's not all on recall and it's not obviously not on recall. Is there a way where you can have those kind of assessments in subjects because the core skill of being a historian, for example, isn't necessarily knowing all the facts off the top of your head, because people have textbooks. You don't need to. When you go out if you become a historian, you go and research, you look into things, you don't have to memorize them. You just have the skills to analyze, to critique, to compare, to draw out patterns, to compare different times in history and find links and wherever else and see what's consistent or the common denominators and everything else. That skill can be tested. Well, can that skill be tested in a way that doesn't rely on kids having to memorize so many things?
So
if you can get an assessment that, well, SUMMIS that has an element of either it's unseen material or either it's you're provided with, everyone's given the same material and it's about what you do with it, as opposed to you need to arrive to the exam hall having all these things in your head. And if you don't have them in your head, then you're going to struggle. that's where things become a bit more tricky at the moment. With the way assessments are at the moment, I feel like that's one of the difficult things. If your memory's not there, and if you arrive at the exam hall without things in your head memorized, then you struggle. And I feel like we should surely have, well, I say should surely. I wonder if there's scope for a better approach to enable those kind of students, or to get a better chance of success, essentially.
Daisy?
So I think this, what we've said there is a great example of how assessment and what we do in assessment goes to the heart of how we think about education.
Yeah.
And what I would say is actually all of the things you've talked about. So all those skills you've talked about being a historian. So being able to spot patterns, being able to, sort of think critically about evidence, being able to, I guess I would say, also in history, a big thing is like, being able to think about causation, right? I would say all of those things, what we've got to look at is, what are those skills? Let's think about those skills. And let's look at the research. What do we know from cognitive science about what those skills rely on? And what we know from cognitive science, and we have learned more about how the human mind works in the last 50 years than in like the previous, kind of 5,000 or whatever, is that all of those skills depend on knowledge and they depend on memory. So this idea that all those skills are opposed to memory and that memorization is just getting in the way of those skills, I would say that is fundamentally wrong. And that in order to be a good problem solver, in order to think critically, and in order to spot causation, you need domain-specific skills. And there is a whole literature on this within a lot of subjects, and even within the field of history. So what does it mean to be a good historian? So actually, let's imagine a student who knows a lot about the Second World War, and they know a lot about the causes of the Second World War, and they can write something fantastic about the causes of the Second World War. That's great, but does that mean, therefore, they can automatically kind of transfer that over and write about the cause of the First World War if they don't know anything about the cause of the First World War? No, they can't. They're going to need to learn some stuff about the First World War. And that's just the reality of it. And the same would be true of even a professional historian. That even professional historians, you listen to them, they'll say, well, I have my area of expertise where I know a lot. And, when I'm outside of that area of expertise, yeah, sure, I can like look things up, or whatever, but I don't have necessarily that domain specific knowledge. And so the domain specificity of skills is like one of the massive findings of modern cognitive science. So this idea that there is this abstract critical thinking skill that you can just transfer over between different bits of history or different domains, it's just not the case. And, I can give loads of examples of this, and give some jokey examples. I remember reading one once about, a physics teacher who was saying, I'm a really great problem solver when it comes to physics. I'm not a great problem solver when it comes to my marriage, right? That's an extreme example. There's a great academic paper by one of the foremost researchers in this field where it's got the most fantastic name. Could Steven Spielberg have managed the Yankees? And he's talking about, Steven Spielberg is a massively creative person who has made all these kind of massive breakthroughs in, film and creating these films that no one could have imagined. Could he have applied that creativity to being the manager of, a baseball team? And the conclusion is no, because to be creative and to be expert, you need domain specificity. And that domain specificity rests on knowledge. And so then to come back to this point about memorization, memorization is not this kind of isolated, abstract, bolt-on thing that you can outsource to Google, right? So again, let's have an example from maths, for example. Yeah, or let's have an example actually with reading. So let's imagine you're reading a passage, okay, and you don't understand 1% of the words. Okay, you can look up that 1%. Let's imagine you don't understand 5%, 10%, 20%. What happens then? Yeah, you can still look things up, but what happens then is it's a massive drain on your working memory. Okay, and our working memories are limited. And this is the fundamental kind of psychological reason why memorizing facts matters. It's because our working memories are incredibly limited. So we can handle 4 to 7 new items of information at any one time. And that's kind of just a human limitation. It's not like there's some genius out there who can manage 20, right? We're all limited. And as far as we know, a lot of people try to work out this. There's no way you can expand that. You are stuck with your 4 to 7 items of new information. And if you don't believe me, whenever I do a session on this, I'll put up a string of numbers, a string of 20 digits, and I'll say, how many can you remember? Yeah. And I've done this with thousands of people now. people get 4 to 7 items, 4 to 7 numbers. That's what they can remember. So we have these incredibly puny working memories. So what is the way we can get around it if we can't actually increase it? The way we get around it is long-term memory. And so by committing facts to long-term memory, we don't have to rely on working memory anymore. So let's give an example from maths. You're in the shops and you are looking to, a 3 for 2 offer. Is it actually a good deal or isn't it? If you have to painstakingly kind of do every calculation, either by getting out a calculator or a pen and paper, it's one of those situations where literally you will have kids who they get to the end of the problem and they've forgotten what the beginning was. Whereas if you've got your times tables really fluent, it just happens automatically, right? You don't even have to kind of think about it because it's all there in long-term memory. And so let's go back to that history example. This is why I think it is incredibly important for kids to memorize a framework of facts and a framework of world dates and historical dates. And I think that is not opposed to historical understanding. That is a prerequisite for historical understanding. And if we're particularly thinking about something like causation, which is a key part of any historical, inquiry, I just literally don't know how you can think about causation without having some idea of, what the events are and when they happen, and having that so solid that you don't have to think about it, that it's automatic. Now, I accept the point that for some students, that is going to be harder than others. But the other thing I would say is the more facts you have, the easier it is to learn more new facts. But so there is a kind of really bad paradox here, is that often those kids who struggle to learn facts, it's not because they're deficient in some way. It's just because, there's this thing called the Matthew effect, that the more you have, the easier it is to learn more. So often the kids who are racing away and learning things and find it easy to learn things, it's because they've got a really nice solid base to begin with. And so by telling the kids who don't have that, oh, look, don't worry, you can just focus on other things, we're actually making it even harder for them to catch up. So I would say it's really important for all students to have that bedrock of really crucial, the framework of facts, and that actually, to a certain extent, that is skill. And the really deep and interesting insight from modern cognitive science is that skill is just applied knowledge. It's just a very large and flexible body of knowledge that's been committed to memory in, a really secure way. It's not this kind of separate thing that's opposed to knowledge. It is knowledge.
One thing I was going to throw in there, Daisy, is that even I agree with a lot of what you've said there about embedding things into memory and actually and the sort of value in that. I agree with all that. The bit that I wonder about is the high stakes nature of our exam system as it currently is, in the sense that if you're a student in school and you enter year 11 at the moment, so you're 15 going into 16, you enter year 11, and suddenly the entire focus becomes about preparing for those exams. Now, I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying to me, that's what happens. We become very focused on getting the students prepared for, and the students themselves know that they're so high stakes, those GCSE exams, that they need to pass those exams. So it's almost like a lot of other things go out the window, and the students and teachers and everybody else are going to do anything they can in terms of, okay, if it means we learn some of these things for the test, then we're going to do that because of how high stakes this is and how crucial it is that we get these results. The students think that. Many teachers, even if they don't think it, they have to think it because of how important that is within our system. So I guess what I'm saying is, even though I think that element of what you were saying in terms of the value of remembering things, I totally get all that. But how does that tie into the issue of your sort of one-off high stakes exam system that we currently have?
Yeah, so no, you make a good point there. So look, let's take the point. Let's say that we agree on that bedrock of like cognitive science and knowledge is important, and knowledge, skill is applied knowledge. So then the question becomes, I think what you're saying is, well, essentially the question is, how do we design an exam system and indeed an education system that best kind of promotes all of those good learning things that we know from the science. Is that fair to say? That's what we all want, right? We want to create
an assessment
an assessment system that encourages the kind of good learning practices that we know about from cognitive science.
And also for me, and this is just me personally speaking now, and I don't know what Kalil thinks, we'll ask him in a minute, but for me, it's creating a system that is not as high stakes in the sense that a 2-hour exam at the end of a 2-year course, that sort of thing.
Right. So where I would say, you know, where I'd to the extent to which I'd agree with that. So I think we are agreed that we want to create a system that promotes all the good learning practice, and we agree on what the good learning practice is. And what you're saying is our current assessment system isn't promoting that, and your biggest issue is the high stakes nature of the assessments, right?
I mean,
So you think they don't? You think they're not promoting? Your argument is particularly the high stakes nature of stuff is not promoting good learning practice. It's promoting like shortcuts, or it's promoting kind of things that are not good for long-term learning. Is that your argument?
My personal argument is, on the whole, yes.
Right. So where I would agree with you. So where I would say the current kind of high stakes system of terminal exams is problematic in terms of promoting good learning practices. The one area that I think it is problematic is cramming, right? So what we know from all of the research is that cramming is bad, okay? So and what we also know is that whilst cramming is bad for long-term learning, so if we're all interested in all the things I said about long-term learning and blah, 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 cramming is not great. But what we also know is that cramming is not great for long-term learning, but it often does work for getting you through an exam, okay? So if all you are interested in, if like you say, if we've got a high stakes system of terminal exams and all a kid is interested in is just getting the grade, potentially the shortcut is to cram like mad the night or couple of nights before, regurgitate all in the exam, and come out the next day, a couple of days later, forget everything, but end up with a decent grade. Okay? So that critique definitely has some truth to it. And I would say that is probably the biggest weakness of high stakes terminal exams. But again, and so I think you've absolutely got to acknowledge that, right? The question then becomes, how do we design a system that prevents that? And this is where it gets really difficult, because
that's why I've invited you on, Daisy.
Yeah. Sorry?
That's why I've invited you on. Right. We're going to crack it.
Let's do it. Let's crack it. Let's crack it, Tom. So where it gets difficult is all of the other ways of kind of designing exam systems, I think potentially actually just make that problem worse. So let's take, people often say, right, terminal exams, that's the problem. What we need are modular exams, and modular exams will make cramming less likely. But it's actually the reverse. Modular exams make cramming easier and more likely, and they actually preclude you having a genuinely like synoptic overall vision of your subject. Yeah. So again, let me give an example. I'll give an example from English when I used to teach on a coursework module. What you would used to have is you'd have a coursework essay on Great Expectations, a coursework essay on Romeo and Juliet, a coursework essay like a piece of creative writing or whatever. So there was kind of 6 coursework essays. You do them all in year 10. And I remember, we used to schedule kind of, I think, the Romeo and Juliet maybe at the start of year 10. And so what would happen is the kids would study Romeo and Juliet for half a term, write their coursework essay at the end of the year 10 half term, right? And then that's it. They never looked at Shakespeare again. Okay? And then let's say those kids, they're now coming on to do A-level, and you're like, right, we've now got to read the whole of Othello. And it was 2 years ago when they read Romeo and Juliet, and they maybe only read a scene of it because they were writing an essay on it. So all those problems you've got about like cramming, they're just as prevalent, if not more, with a modular system. And again, Ofqual did some research on this when they moved away from modular system. And that is the issue, that this modular system, it leads to this kind of banking model of education where you think, oh, I've banked my Romeo and Juliet. It's all those problems you were saying about long-term learning.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So the issue is, I think your critique of exams, high-stakes terminal exams leading to cramming, I think that is a genuine issue. But I think modular systems, it's even more of an issue. So then what is the solution? And having thought about this a lot, I genuinely think that there is an extent to which you cannot assessment your way out of a curriculum problem. That what you are talking about here, the issue, is fundamentally an issue of the curriculum and of curriculum sequencing. And look, I will say this about anything: if someone is absolutely determined to kind of do things the wrong way and to cheat, it's hard to kind of build a system that will stop that. What I think we have to try and do is to build kind of syllabuses and schemes of work and curriculum sequences which schedule which schedule kind of all of the learning in such a way that students almost inevitably, if they're attending school and like following the curriculum, are going to have things sequenced in such a way that they're going to be kind of learning for the long term. So that's why I think, if we're looking at a typical kind of GCSE course, we have to be looking at developing ways of saying, look, this is the optimal way of sequencing and teaching the content on this course. So go back to my, give a concrete example, go back to my Romeo and Juliet example. Let's say now we're in a world where we've got a terminal exam with the Romeo and Juliet at the end of the 2 years.
Yeah.
What we've got to come up with is what is the best way of teaching across those 2 years that will promote kind of long-term learning, and the exam success. And what can we do to, develop the resources and the CPD and the student revision techniques and everything we need that will deliver that? And maybe it's saying, right, okay, maybe we do it in a block of a half term at the start of year 10, but then maybe one day every 10 days, I don't know, I'm making, I'm coming up with things here, you're having like some form of quick revision. Right, and that revision, you're tweaking that and optimizing that so the students are not forgetting kind of Romeo and Juliet, right? So I do think that we have to. The thing about assessment system is we cannot expect the assessment system on its own to do all the heavy lifting. That we cannot. There is no way of designing a test that is so perfect that it will just automatically lead to, the right teaching and the right way of getting towards it. Like, we can't expect that. You can't put that weight on any form of assessment. What we have to do is create assessment systems almost that don't encourage bad practice. So I think there are some assessment systems which almost encourage bad practice. So we have to come up with an assessment system that almost creates the space for a good curriculum. We can't expect that an assessment system will create, be the good curriculum in and of itself. What we just have to expect is that the curriculum can create a space, the assessment can create a space for teachers and everyone involved in education to create the good curriculum. And that is what we are trying to do at No More Marking. Okay, that is very, very much what we're doing. We have obviously a summative assessment that we think cuts down loads of the bad practice involved in rubrics. And we are building up the right sequencing of lessons that is going to help students become better writers. So everything I'm saying here, I'm trying to live. I'm trying to live what I'm saying. That I'm trying to create summative assessments that leave the space open for good teaching, and then to fill up that space with the good teaching, and all the time to be monitoring what's happening to check that the lessons we're creating are working and are helping students become better writers.
Just before we move on, I want to say thanks everybody for joining in. I hope you're enjoying this discussion as much as I am. It's really, really fascinating. So thanks everybody who's dropped in live. I mean, obviously this will be available to listen back to as well as a podcast. If you are listening and you fancy doing what I'm doing and could probably do a better job, then DM Teachers Talk Radio to get yourself a little host pack and find out more about hosting with us and all the benefits of doing that. The other thing I want to do is thank our sponsors for this evening, which is John Catt Educational and Witherslack. If you want to find out more about them, they're both pinned to the tweets at the top of this space, so you can just have a little browse in your own time on those two. If anybody wants to comment or get involved in the discussion tonight, then you can just hit the little icon in the bottom right hand side with a little speech bubble in it, and you can send us a tweet and we will reply to it, or we will pose it to our panelists this evening, and try to engage in some conversation around it. Alternatively, if you want to actually ask a question verbally, then just hit the little mic icon in the bottom left-hand side to request in to speak. So, Kalil, I want to ask you what your thoughts on all that was. I mean, do you think the assessment system is relevant and fair? How would you want to see it change, or are you happy with the status quo?
Surely it comes. A lot of this comes down to what we're even trying to prepare students for. Because from my understanding, in all my years of teaching and being in secondary school, that the whole education system at the moment in secondary school is geared towards equipping kids to go on to further education. And if that, I don't see it, and I think we're starting in a lot of schools at the moment trying to develop like richer curriculums where they actually expose kids to not just kind of I would say grades factory, that kind of push towards further education only. But I think that's what the education system was set up for. It was set up to get people into higher education so they can go into the workforce. And the problem, well, I say problem, and higher education is assessed a lot of higher education is assessed in these kind of summative ways where you have to produce where you have to either sit down in an exam hall for a long period of time, 3 hours at a time, and you're assessed that way, or you're writing up whether it's a dissertation or thesis or whatever you're writing up, which again is rigorous work. So then the secondary education system is preparing kids for that. That's what it's doing at the moment, in my opinion. So that means I understand why our assessment practices are a kind of microcosm of what's largely expected in university when you go down the kind of academic route. Is that right? Who knows? Depends what you think the purpose of education is. If you think the purpose of secondary education is to prepare for higher education, then maybe it's doing what it's supposed to do. But not everyone goes on to higher education. So what's happening with those people? What's happening with those people? I agree, by the way, with there was a lot on what Daisy said about the curriculum and the emphasis on that. I wholeheartedly agree. In an ideal world, your focus is a broad, rich curriculum, and then the byproduct of that is kids also do well in their assessments, but they leave school. They should leave school with their eyes opened to as many different opportunities as possible, or as many different avenues, as many different bodies of knowledge that they can now, explore and dive into. And doing well in their assessments was also a byproduct of that. I think that's what I'd want from schooling system. Rather than being assessment driven, you want to be curriculum driven. And then they also happen to do well in assessments. Are the schools there? No, because there's a lot of focus on grade performance. So then schools just operate in the climate that we're in. So then they just focus on grades. So then they say, well, we're going to forego this rich curriculum. We're just going to focus on getting these grades because that's what we need at the moment in this Ofsted world. I'm not going to I'm sorry I mentioned the O word, Tom, by the way, because I know it's.
Don't worry, I'm feeling pretty chill tonight, Kalil. And also Amanda Spielman dropped in. So Amanda, come back, join the conversation. We want to hear what Amanda Spielman thinks about all of this. She came and she went. Come on, come back.
But like I said, I think in summary, I think it's down to purpose. If we're saying education's there, if education's there to prepare kids for further education, then I can't see another way of assessing, because that's unfortunately the way that further education ends up being assessed. So you need to mirror it. But is that what education's supposed to be there for in this day and age, with 2022, where there's so many different avenues that people can go to? I know the schooling system was first, correct me if I'm wrong, but first kind of established to just get people to learn how to operate in a kind of restrictive kind of work environment, so they'd be trained in their character, so that when they left, they could just kind of go into work and know what's expected. But we're not in that day and age anymore.
I want to trigger Daisy again, because Daisy, you've written an article for Schools Week, and part of it talks about jobs don't change that fast.
So I think Kalil's making some tremendous points here about what is the point of education, and I think he's absolutely right to do that, because, and I talk about this a lot, like what is the point of education? And I think that Kalil's right in that, potentially we do say too much that education is about preparing for jobs, and we do say too much that it's about further education. And I would like a more expansive kind of view of it, which would be preparing students to be good citizens.
Yeah.
Which I think would include, I'm not saying I'm against preparing for jobs, like that's obviously a part of being a good citizen, right? But I would like a more expansive view, and that would take into account both that economic aspects, but also aspects around, you know, contributing to your community, understanding the world you live in. You know, it's important to understand the world you live in, not just because it's going to make you money or get you a job, but because you're going to have some awareness of, you know, what's going on in the world and how the people around you think and what have you. So I would like a more expansive definition. And I think the ones that focus too narrowly on jobs are problematic. And yeah, I've written an awful lot about how I think there are some very misleading things as well about
But Daisy, sorry,
about
go on.
jobs of the future. Yeah, so go on.
But could I just wanted to cut in and ask you though, if we think about artificial intelligence and as one element of that, automation, right? Automation, artificial intelligence. In the not so distant future, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, so much that we do now is going to probably be automated. I'll give you a little example. There was a show on Teachers Talk Radio last week, Graham Stanley, on artificial intelligence. And during this show, he demoed writing artificial intelligence writing software where you input a title like Tom's Journey to Work and it writes a story for you. Right?
Yeah, I've spent all day, you know, at work. We spent a chunk of the time today playing around with this. So yeah, you know, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Now, my point is that now, obviously, I understand that, you know, the value is in someone being able to do something. I get that. But when we're entering a world where potentially everybody can just cheat, what's the point? I'm being very cynical now, but you know, yes, children, of course, need to know how to read and write because they wouldn't be able to use the artificial intelligence writing generator in the first place, but without knowing what it was asking them to do. But equally, you know, if they said write a story about jelly beans and all they need to do is write the word jelly beans and press return and it writes the story for them, and then they can read that story and then maybe edit it or use it however. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. And look, I think these are fascinating issues, and I'm fascinated by GPT-3, you know, this AI tool. And I wrote a chunk about this. I wrote my book, Teachers vs. Tech, a couple of years ago about this. And the world moves on very fast, but I still think what I wrote in that holds really true. And and this goes back to my point about it's not just about training for a job, it's about being a citizen, it's about being a human being, right? So here's the example I give, okay? Like almost maybe 100, 200 years ago, people had a similar kind of panic around machines being stronger and faster than humans. And there's, I can't remember the exact kind of thing about it now, but there's this, there's even this kind of, you know, folk song around like, you know, when the machine that's chipping away at rock gets better than like the human being doing it. And then people are like, my God, what's going to happen? You know, the machines are better than humans. And in physical terms, for a long time now, we're accustomed to the fact that there are machines that are way more efficient and powerful than humans, right? But does that mean that we say, well, you know, there's no point like, you know, playing football, there's no point running, or there's no point being fit and healthy because, you know, we can just rely on the machine? Like, no, we don't say that because, you know, going for a run or playing a sport or being active and healthy, like that's part of being a human being that we want to do, right? So in a sense, the fact that we've been freed from the economic necessity of this, you know, that's incredibly liberating that we haven't got the economic necessity of it. But, you know, it means we want to do it for human flourishing. And the other analogy I talk about a lot, I talk about the development of like drawing and the camera. So if you go back again a couple of 100 years, Royal Navy cadets, part of their training was to learn to draw. Okay. And the reason they had to learn to draw, it wasn't because they were trying to make them more sensitive and expressive. It was because to be like a good naval officer, you've got to be able to, like, you know, drawing was like a really valuable skill. You know, it had this like economic necessity, right? And that is not true anymore because we've got cameras.
Yeah.
So, you know, that economic necessity of learning to draw has been, you know, taken away by a camera. But does that mean we don't learn to draw? Like, no. Like, if you're going to just define everything in terms of, well, if a computer can do it, we shouldn't do it, that's crazy. And actually, that's not how we live. And another analogy, you can see all these, chess is really similar. So when Kasparov lost to Deep Blue, there were all these people who said, chess is over. No one's going to want to play chess anymore because the computer can win it. Chess actually has had a complete renaissance. And actually, the fact that all the computers now are way better than humans, people still want to have human games of chess. And in fact, they play the games of chess as humans, and then they run them through the engine and they think about how they could have got better, and the engines help them to learn chess better. So I think we need to get away from this idea. Like, if we are going to move to a world, I'm not convinced it is true we're going to move to the world where the machines, can do everything. But actually, if we do move to that world, in lots of ways, amazing, right? That we remove a lot of these economic necessity. It's a new era of abundance. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And then education is about human flourishing, right? And it's about what do we need to do as humans to be the best humans we can be.
But
okay, so that would be my point.
My question, though, would be, is that, for example, if I'm a student and I'm 15, 16, 17 years old, and I understand your point about the nature of learning and the joy of learning and the things that can be produced by humans. I get all that. But if I'm a 15-year-old who's maybe not got many opportunities, and my success later on isn't particularly secure in the sense that, I know, or I don't know, but I'm looking at my lessons, my curriculum in school, and I'm going, is this going to help me in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years time? If some of them, for example, let me put out there entrepreneurship, right? Let's say the entrepreneurship, I know we've got business studies, I get that, but I'm saying, let's say that became one. I know I'm not saying it should happen, but I'm saying, let's say it did become one of the core subjects. One of the core subjects on the curriculum was entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And the reason we're doing that is because we're saying that, and sorry about this, Kalil, but we're saying that a lot of, say, for example, the stuff we do in maths will be done by robots. And that's why we're making that change, because the skill of entrepreneurship or ideas generation.
So I mean, look, a number of problems with this. Okay, so and I do work like this kind of extensively in Teachers versus Tech. So I'm not just kind of making this up on the spur at the moment. So we've got two possible worlds, right? We've got world one where the machines are going to take over and do everything, and kind of,
Daisy, if someone just joined this space now, we are actually having a serious conversation.
Yeah. And then we've got world two where actually that's overhyped, and there's always going to be more of a role for humans in the economy than we think. So there's two broad kind of world views there, and I'd probably lean towards the second, but I see the point of the first, and making predictions in this stuff is not easy, right? But my argument is, whichever one of those worldviews you subscribe to, or if you're somewhere in the middle, you still can't have entrepreneurship on the curriculum. Because entrepreneurship is still, in order to have that skill of entrepreneurship, it is still dependent. It's all that stuff I said before about working memory, right? It's still dependent on, I don't know, knowing what compound interest is, which ultimately then is dependent on, your times tables, right? So even if the robots can do loads of things, it goes back to my drawing example, my chess example. Like, robots are better at chess. Machines are better at chess. If you want to learn chess, you don't just suddenly default because a computer can play chess for you. You don't just suddenly default and start learning chess at a much higher level. You still have to learn, like, the pawn makes this move, and this is what castling is, and this is the king. You still have to learn the basic moves. So
Hold on, why?
Whatever worldview you are existing on the role of machines in the future economy, entrepreneurship should not be a school subject.
Kalil?
No, I just wondered why. What's your reason for why it can't be a school subject? Because
entrepreneurship is what I said before about skills. I think
because you need the foundations in order to become an entrepreneur.
I love
Then why can't you just do it when you're like 16, 17?
So so that's okay. So I love entrepreneurship. I think entrepreneurship is brilliant, right? It goes back to all the things I was saying before about skills. But entrepreneurship rests on domain-specific skills. And, at the primary, secondary, even I would say upper secondary level, like, the role is to be acquiring those domain-specific skills that are going to enable you to be an entrepreneur. Okay, and I would say actually even at university, like, you need some element of what are the kind of actually specific skills, the domain specific knowledge you need to be an entrepreneur, right? So, and again, being an entrepreneur in one domain is really different from being an entrepreneur in another, right? I used to work on a market stall. My mum and dad ran market stalls all their lives, right? And they used to sell clothes. They used to sell kind of handkerchiefs. I would tell you something. If you're on a stall selling clothes and handkerchiefs, people always joke, don't they? One of my favourite jokes when people say about politicians, they say, "Oh, you couldn't manage a whelk stall." And I always say, do you know how hard it is to run a whelk stall? Yeah, because fish goes off. So if you're an entrepreneur running a whelk stall and you're an entrepreneur running a clothes stall, that in itself, those are two quite domain-specific things. Like your whole logistics setup is totally different. My parents didn't want to run a whelk stall because stuff goes off. Yeah, people get sick, right? So that is my example of domain specificity. We're not having lessons on entrepreneurship. Let's have a lesson on, the underlying knowledge and skills you need to become an entrepreneur.
But Daisy, just to say that again, because this is really interesting to me, is okay. Let's imagine I sit there as a 13-year-old and entrepreneurship is one of the topics, if you like, on the curriculum, maybe even a core subject. And for example, one thing we don't teach, I don't think we teach young people how to sell, for example. You just mentioned market stalls, right?
It matters what you're selling. It really does matter what you're selling. Yeah. I would say this is someone who's done this. What you sell matters.
Yeah, but I'm saying that.
And I think actually people are like,
Yeah, but I'm saying take it as But say, take it as an example. It's a student who wants to set up a shop or a market stall or something, and they want to sell fruit, right? They don't. For me, do they need to have knowledge of fruit to do that? Do they need to have knowledge of the product, or do they need to have knowledge of the seller?
Well, look, I'd say, shall I tell you what the most useful? Shall I tell you? Look, I've just said to you, I don't think everything should be about the economy. But shall I tell you what the two most useful? Every study that's been done everywhere in the world, what are the two most useful, economically valuable skills? Literacy and numeracy. It's not learning how to sell.
Oh, Daisy, you're just cutting out a bit. I don't know if that's just me though.
One sec. Let me move. Hang on.
Daisy was clear. Daisy's been clear for me. Tom, it was you that was cutting out a little while ago.
Is that just me, or is Daisy cutting out? Can someone tell me?
I don't know. Your voice cuts out for me. I know that, and I've got full bars. I've got my Wi-Fi is full up to the top, mate. So I feel like I'm safe in this whole thing.
It'll be me. I'm gonna move. I'm gonna move just in case it's me. Sorry, Daisy. Carry on, because I didn't hear that last bit.
So there is a global research literature on this. What are the most valuable? So I've just said I don't think the whole of school should be about the economy, right? That's whether or not the robots take over or not. For me, it is about more than that. But if it were to be, what are the two most valuable, economically valuable skills? And there is, like I say, a global research literature on this, and it is really clear it is literacy and numeracy, right? Those are the two things. And we do not, and most countries do not, do as good a job as they could on literacy and numeracy. So I would say before we're thinking about kind of, some of this domain unspecific stuff about what it is to sell, I would say, like, can we improve everyone's literacy and numeracy? Like, that is the thing that is going to have a massive economic impact, and it will do all those things I talked about citizenship and being a good citizen and human flourishing too. So that would be my priority.
Interesting stuff. Kalil, do you have any comments on any of this? Because I think it's really interesting. I mean, I know you're a maths teacher. Would you ever, and Catherine's here as well, the executive princess of maths. We've got lots of maths teachers here, and I'm really stoking the fire here. But I'm saying, could you ever envisage a world where maths wasn't a core subject?
No, not at all. That's nonsense. But I think, there are courses out there where they do, because all the fundamental skills that you would need in order to, I don't know, access anything like setting up a business of your own or all those kind of things. I guess there's one argument is you need to learn them first, so that when you want to go and do the business setting up or the independent entrepreneurial activity, whatever you want to call it, if this is in school, you have to learn these skills beforehand. The other argument could be that you learn them underneath the umbrella, like you learn them not at the same time, but as in your skills now have a purpose. So you could have a situation where, and I'm just thinking very fancifully here, you have a situation where I remember teaching a few topics like this in the past, kind of like project-based, where you learn about things like percentages, and you learn about things like interest, you learn about saving, you learn about finance, all through like monetary calculations. You learn the skills and it's all under the umbrella of being able to actually have a purpose with it, because you're going to now and use these skills to go and set up your own this or create your own that. And it meant, when I did this with kids, these kids are about year, what are they now? I think they're about year 12, I think we did it in. I've never seen kids so engaged in like doing mundane tasks, like just mundane arithmetic or mundane calculations or whatever. They were so more engaged with it because it now had a purpose. Because kids always bat it back when you get to like abstract, more abstract maths, saying, when will I ever need this? But in an ideal one, I say ideal world, I love learning for learning's sake, first and foremost. Let me just put that up there. But I also think if so many kids are crying out for, when will I need this? When will I need this? Is there more that we should give as educators to be like, you know what? Let's actually create something that's going to show when you will need this, as opposed to falling back on, well, sometimes it gets good to know some more things than you did before you came in the room, which is great, by the way. I do agree with it. But I guess my main point is this entrepreneurial thing that you were talking about. I was just playing devil's advocate, just thinking, if it were a course, if it were a subject, could you somehow create it so that all the fundamentals were still taught, but were taught with a purpose? So you can explain, we are going to learn how to do X because we will later need it when you create this for yourself. We're then going to learn about how to do Y so that later on you're going to need it to therefore create this for yourself. And then you provide them with the skills, and then you let them flourish, and you send them off like little birds and little doves, and you say, right, go and create something using these skills. I feel like you get more buy-in from kids, personally. I just wonder if there's an element of that we could somehow get into the education system. I would have that in my school, personally. I would want a little bit of that for the older kids.
Daisy, any thoughts on any of that from Kalil? Oh, you might need to unmute yourself, bottom left.
Sorry, yeah, great.
There you go.
I think you definitely want to make it clear to students. I think it is important to you need to have hooks. You know, a lot of what we teach in schools is abstract, and you do need to have hooks. You know, the word relevant is a tricky one. Like, sometimes I hear the word relevant and I get really worried about it. But you do need to have a hook that gets students to understand why it is that the concepts, that these abstract concepts you're teaching, you know, that the relevance they have. And you know, compound interest, which I briefly mentioned earlier, is a good example, because compound interest is one of these classic kind of quite abstract concepts. And I mean, I think there's a great Einstein quotation where he says, yeah, something like, I mean, probably Einstein didn't say it, because half, you know, all the quotes on the internet that Einstein said he didn't say, but there is some there is some kind of famous thing about compound interest, that people who understand what compound interest is will benefit from it, and those who don't understand it are doomed to be paying it. Okay.
Yeah,
and
that sounds about right.
Yeah, it's not a massively advanced mathematical topic. You know, it's a relatively, you know, it's not simple either, but it's not crazy advanced. It's not like we'd say, oh, only a few pupils could ever get their head around it. You know, and it's something that's got enormous implications. We were talking about entrepreneurship for that, but for whole loads of things in life, right? So what is kind of the right way of teaching that? So I definitely think that if you were starting to teach that, you know, it would totally be appropriate to give some bit of an explanation about why this is quite an important concept and the enormous impact it can have on your life. Where I do get slightly wary, though, is if we were going to say, you know, and you were talking about kind of project-based learning, the project-based learning problem goes back to what I was saying before about working memory, long-term memory, is that we have limited working memory. So the problem with all project-based learning is that you're overloading working memory, because you are just there's so many other things going on other than just learning about kind of the compound interest, right? So if you're going to, and again, the compound interest is a good example, I would say if you want to teach that, totally appropriate to have a hook at the start of the unit where you talk about some of the really important applications. But there needs to be, in order for students to really understand it, and go back to what we were saying right at the start, the long-term learning, there needs to be massive opportunity for deliberate practice of lots of examples of compound interest.
Yeah.
And that is what is going to give you that understanding of it. So I think projects, we've got to be careful. Like, I'm all for getting kids to see why something is important, but we also have to have the kind of really focused time to focus on these difficult concepts and really master them.
In an ideal world, Daisy, would you have both?
Well, in ideal world, it wouldn't be that both. Again, it's not a both. It's, for me, it's not that the two are opposed. Like, what I would have instead of both is I'd have like a staircase that goes up, and the staircase might go up over years. It's not just over a couple of weeks. So, I think when you start teaching, you're breaking stuff down into the smallest constituent parts because you don't want to overload working memory. And the downside of that is that when you break stuff into its constituent parts, it becomes really abstract and doesn't look like it's got much of a basis in the real world. But as I say, the reason you have to do that is when you put it in the real world is not a great learning environment. Okay, that's why we have schools. Like, if the real world was a great learning environment, we wouldn't need schools. So the point is, we're constantly kind of doing this balancing act in that if we're just doing the real world task, that's going to overwhelm working memory. So we have to be breaking it down. But you're absolutely right. We can't lose sight that there is an end goal, which is putting all the pieces together into the real world task. So I've talked about combat interest. I'm not a maths teacher. Let me go back to writing, which I do a lot. We do a lot of writing assessment. The end goal is to write fluently and write brilliantly. And for me, that almost is a project. Like, to complete a really difficult, complex, lengthy piece of writing on some kind of, any kind of topic, that is almost, that is a project in and of itself. So it's not that I'm saying we never do writing. Like, my day job is assessing writing. Okay. But then what is the best way of teaching that? I don't think, I'm always clear about this, we should be doing extended writing every lesson. I think we need to be breaking it down into its constituent parts, teaching those constituent parts, and then putting them together and making sure we're not putting them together too quickly. And again, that's where we need the formative assessment. Like, at what point are the kids ready to add the next building block? And then when we put the building blocks together, we can build up to that extended piece of writing, which is a bit of a project. So when you're saying, would I have both? It's not about having both. It's about, I always say, it's a sequence. It's a journey. It's not a pendulum. I always say, like, when we think of things as a pendulum, like projects or subjects or knowledge or skills, that's the wrong way of thinking of it as two binaries. Like, instead, think of it as a journey, like a journey up a mountaintop, and it's every little step and every little sequence. And the question is, at what point are the kids ready to take the next step? At what point are they ready for that next step? And
Kalil, is that sort of what you were getting at?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it's more. It's just the we need to have an education system that answers the question. Well, in an ideal world, answers the question. I feel like there's a gap on the when will I use this? When will I need this? So that's all. That's when I was asking, would you want to do both? What I'm asking is, yes, I know you need deliberate practice in order to master a specific skill. You'll need that. You can't just be taught it once and then be expected to apply it. I get that. When I meant, is there both? What I mean is, in an ideal world, should we be having enough time to be able to do the practice so that they can become fluent, but then there needs to be, well, not needs to be, some form of a lot of the practice, and then we build up to an assessment where what they're really being assessed on is if they can still do that same thing they've been doing deliberately for a while and just splurge it out. Or is there something more we can do to give them something? Like, I know you're saying how you get like cognitive overload when you have those kind of problems, but then that's also the real world. So are we supposed to be trying to prepare them for that? So when they get older.
Yeah, my whole thing about the real world, there is a paradox here. It's chicken and egg. For the real world isn't always to do real world tasks.
Yeah.
And I realise that sounds paradoxical, but that's like the reality of a lot of things. It goes back to my marathon example. Like, do you get better at a marathon by running a marathon every day? No. You look at someone who goes to yoga class and goes, oh, well, that's not a real world running task. You're just doing yoga. It's like, no, like, actually, people who do yoga or they're going to the gym, that is going to make them a better runner, even though it doesn't look like running. I always joke here, actually, that, what converted me to the thought yoga could work. I don't know if you remember, like, Ryan Giggs, he had all these injury problems as a young player. And everyone was like, oh, his career is going to end really young because he has all these injury problems. And he ended up playing at the highest level till he was like 40, right? and he was this big yoga enthusiast. And this is in the 90s, and people, you know, a lot of these grizzled like commentators on football were like, what is a footballer doing yoga? Like, what a joke thing to do. You know, my day, they just played football solidly. You know, you just went out and you played 3 times a week, and that's how you got better at football. And it's like, well, yeah, and that's how like your career ends at the age of 28, right? So you can get really kind of old fashioned and be like, the way you get better at stuff is just doing it, and you just got to learn in the real world. And it's like, well, maybe we should be thinking, you know, a bit more laterally and say maybe, you know, a bit less running, a little bit more yoga. Maybe that makes you a better runner, you know. So that's what I'm saying about all of these things. Like, we definitely want to prepare kids for the real world. Does that mean doing real world tasks over and over again? Not necessarily.
Blooming heck, Kalil.
Oh no, like I feel like we're going around in circles. So I'm happy to move on. It's no problem at all. Can we talk about marketing? Let's talk about marketing.
Well, I wanted to. That's what I wanted to finish off on, Daisy. I don't know if you've got another 5 minutes or whatever, but I wanted to talk about marking, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that in many schools around the country, there are still requirements for frequency of marking. There is still a big emphasis on written marking. What are your thoughts, Daisy, on marking and marking policies?
So I think I'm a big advocate. I think, you know.
Oh, Daisy, you're just dropping it. I don't know if it's me, but it feels like you're going distant from the mic and then close to the mic.
Let me. How's that?
That's better, I think.
Okay, great. I think that for me, one of the things I think if you're a senior leader and you're in charge of assessment in your school, one of the things I'd always say is try and time cost your school's marking policy, and try and look at it and say, if a teacher did this marking policy honestly and fairly, and they did everything that's required of it, how much time would it take? And when you do that with a lot of marking policies, they are totally unsustainable.
Yeah,
they're just not realistic. And then the other thing I say, don't just do it for English and math. Do it for RE. Do it for history. Do it for the teacher who's teaching 300 kids a week. Once a week. They're teaching 300 kids.
Yeah.
And a lot of marking policies are not sustainable. And then not only are they incredibly burdensome. So the thing I hate about written comments is written comments, for me, they're like the worst of both worlds. They take forever and they're not that useful. Right? So the thing I say about them is, there's a great Dylan William quotation on this where he says, he once heard a student, he once asked a student be given the feedback, you need to be more systematic in planning your scientific inquiries. And he says to the student, what does that mean to you? You know, what does that feedback mean to you? And the student says, I don't know. If I'd known how to be more systematic, I would have been so the first time. And that's quite flippant, right? But when I read that for the first time, I cringed, because I thought, how many hours of my life did I spend, often on a Sunday evening, writing out comments that were that vague? And not just that, but the same comment like 10, 15, 20 times, right? And the point about those comments is they don't help students to improve. And Dylan William, he goes on, he says they're true but useless. They're like telling an unsuccessful comedian to be funnier, right? So what we need to be giving students is, an action step they can take that is going to help them get better. And the other thing we need to be doing, another Dylan William line, is what we need to be focusing on is, it's not about improving the piece of work, it's about improving the student's thinking. So it's not about go back and correct this work so it's a better piece of work and it's a higher grade. It's about, what are you going to do so you think differently next time, so when you next come to do a piece of work, you're not going to make that mistake, or the piece of work is going to be better. So I think the best way of doing feedback from those big complex tasks is not to write comments at the bottom. And I always joke as well, imagine if when you were doing a 3-point term and you learned to drive, the instructor said, I'll give you a written comment in a week's time. It's insane, right? So it's incredibly time consuming. Everyone hates it and it doesn't help. So I think we just have to find a better way of doing it. So I really like whole class feedback for complex tasks, which is the idea the teacher will read all the essays. Yeah. And then the next lesson, they'll spend the lesson, they'll replan the next lesson based on the strengths and weaknesses they've seen. That's just far more efficient, far more effective. I also think that should be a bigger role for multiple choice questions, short answer questions, because they can be very efficient too. So I think we've got to have a serious think about, time is the currency of education. We've got to have a serious think about, are we spending that time in the best ways? And what could we do to spend it better to get more bang for the buck?
Daisy, there was a comment by Phil Beadle on a classic TTR show with Adam Boxer and Phil Beadle where they nearly, had a war with each other over marking. But
Yeah.
one of the comments that Phil Beadle was saying, who's very pro marking, was, what about the student or the parent who has no written comments? How does that make them feel, or how does that,
Yeah.
what's the impact of them not having any written, regular written interaction from the teacher?
So I think, the first thing I'd say to that is what students often don't realise is maybe they get that written interaction and they think that's incredibly personalised. Goes back to to what extent is it? To what extent sometimes is it, the same kind of comment, or a comment that's a bit generic, or a comment that's taken from the mark scheme, right? So that's one thing, like how personalised is it? And then, go back to my question about the driving instructor. Does anyone think their driving instructor is like, doesn't kind of, personally understand them or help them because they don't get a written comment from them? Like, I think you have to have, we're so in this straitjacket of written comments.
Yeah.
Like, if you're seeing a kid for class for an hour a week, even if you're only seeing for an hour a week, then there have to be other ways that you can build that relationship and build that understanding that doesn't depend on an incredibly inefficient and ineffective method of feedback. So, when kids are doing work in class and you're circulating and you're looking over their shoulder, and you're getting an idea of what they're writing, if you're reading all their work and you're still, you're reading it and you're jotting down notes and you're getting a feel for them. If you're setting the multiple choice questions and, you're getting somewhere where you're automatically marking them and you're seeing the patterns and you're seeing the kids whose scores are standing out. Like, look, anyone who's been a teacher, surely you would know that the way you form a relationship with a kid is not just through a written comment. I can't believe that's the only way we can build a kind of intellectual academic relationship.
Kalil?
Yeah, I can summarize this quite succinctly. I think from my perspective, I think the time spent reading over work and then also writing things on, I don't know, 20 to 30 different students' piece of work. That time spent is better spent reading the work and then not having to write anything, and then instead spending your time planning about what you're going to do next lesson to make sure that whatever the overall misconceptions or whatever the gaps or whatever the areas for development were or whatever the pitfalls were, that you either adjust your teaching in the subsequent lessons to make sure that they learn, they make progress, and whatever the pitfalls were, they now avoid them. Or even better, you go back to your curriculum, you work out where your gaps were and how we even got to this point. And then the next time you do this with another cohort, you've got an improved delivery of content. That time is better spent. That time is better spent than spending time writing things and saying, and then I used to spend hours you can probably guess, probably not surprised, I was a bit of a maverick. So the previous schools wanted us to write. I ended up writing the same comment on 20 kids' books who all made the same mistake. Yep. I could have spent, and I was like, why am I doing this? What I'm going to do instead is, and I can fully justify this. I know they're going to say I've not abided by the policy, but this was earlier in my career. I was thinking, I'm just going to spend my time thinking, right, if they've all made the same mistake, let me go back and look, where did I go wrong? Because clearly it's a me thing, not a them thing. Like this is my teaching that has led to this if they're all making the same mistake. And I spent time going back and thinking, right, how am I going to re-explain, find new examples, remodel, whatever you want to call it. That time is better spent. That's teaching. But it's easier for maths. I feel like I've never taught a subject where they have to do long piece of, where they do more written work. And I know that's a bit more tricky because you have to actually read more to find the mistakes. Maths is like, oh, you got the question wrong. I can see your error right there. Yeah. I feel like English and histories, everything else is a bit more tricky, which I get why you need to actually read their answers more. But you still don't have to write anything. I don't feel like you need to. Like, I know when I was a kid and the teacher wrote, please do this. I don't think I even did it, to be honest. And I feel like some kids are like that as well. And it's just it's a waste of time. Time is better spent planning. And
I think you're both on the same page there. I mean, Daisy, is there anything you sort of want to say just to sort of summarize?
I totally agree with Kalil. Totally. Everything you said there is true. And it baffles me that we're in this mindset of like the way you personalize is writing a comment. And if you want to, go philosophical about it, you can be philosophical about how prose is, short prose statements are not great ways of communicating. And that's one of the reasons why rubrics are problematic too. They don't give you kind of the precision that you need. So, and I think everything Kalil said there is absolutely on the money. So, yeah.
Just use a verbal feedback stamp. That's all we need to do. Just make sure I agree with everything you said with one proviso. Make sure you use the damn stamp.
We all love a verbal feedback stamp, don't we? Everyone's favourite.
Love it. Daisy, do you know what I was going to do to finish off? You're going to hate this, but I don't have to do it. But I've lined up the University Challenge theme tune and some of the original questions.
Fire away, Tom.
All right, get ready.
Are you going to get done? Are you going to get done for copyright here, Tom?
Probably. Now, in case you're wondering why the hell we're doing this, it's because Daisy won University Challenge. So here we go. Daisy, are you ready with question number 1?
Go.
Well, they say start for 10, don't they? Anyway, yes. Start for 10. We must leave exactly on time. From now on, everything must function to perfection. Whose words were these, spoken to a station master and quoted in 1939, part of the mythology that the trains always ran on time under fascist dictatorships?
Oh.
I'll read the quote again. We must leave exactly on time. From now on, everything must function.
Mussolini.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. You got the start of a 10. Yeah. Next question. Which village near Vienna is the site of the hunting lodge where the Habsburg Crown Prince Rudolf and his paramour, Mary Vestera.
Oh, this is mailing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh, Daisy, you literally took it off my tongue. I was literally. Oh my God.
She hasn't lost it, mate. She hasn't lost it. This is
mate, I couldn't tap the unmute button quick enough. I had that one. Right,
what year was this, Daisy? What year were you on it?
2007, 2006-7.
This is like playing like kick around with a 21-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo. Who's come back for more. Right, here we go. Question 3. What name is that of an Aryan Christian Germanic people who maintained a North African kingdom in the 5th and 6th centuries and who, under their king Gaiseric, sacked Rome in 455?
That's the Vandals.
Correct.
Do you know when they ask these questions on University Challenge? And the thing is, there's something about how many commas are in that question, just so I'm aware. How many commas are in that question? There's about 5, right?
There was only 1 in it.
Stop that.
No, there was only 1 comma in that.
Wowzers. But I feel like when Jeremy Paxman used to ask these questions, when they just went on for a very long time, and then there was so many like caveats and provisos throughout the question, you get to the end. And most people, Daisy, you're I'm not going to put you in the most category here, but most people get to the end just being like, what?
How do you remember the first? No, but genuinely, I always forget the first 4 or 5 words. I'm like, what is going on? Anyway, Daisy, you're on a run here. That's ridiculous that you got all 3 of those right. What the hell? Right, 2 more, and then we're closing the show down.
All right.
Question 4.
Go on.
In cytogenetics, what term describes the entire chromosomal complement of a cell which may be observed during mitotic metaphase?
No, I don't know that.
Kalil Rouse!
So I don't know that.
Are we allowed to ask the audience?
Yes! But they can't speak, so it's irrelevant. But it's karyotype.
Okay, right.
Never heard of it.
Yeah.
Last question. This is a quote. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover gem-like above the bay. This was the last diary entry of which explorer, written on January the 5th, 1922, at Grytviken in South Georgia.
1922. Shackleton.
Correct.
Right.
Do you know what, Tom? I'm so glad that you said 1922 because if I hadn't waited for 1922, I was about to come with the worst answer. I'm not going to say what my answer was.
But right, Daisy, you have officially passed
Okay, it's good to know.
The University Challenge 2, and this was way more important than the first one you ever did that you won with the real Jeremy Paxman. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. It has been an absolute blast. I could listen to you all day. Absolutely immense. Kalil, thanks so much for coming on, mate. Really, really enjoyed your contribution as well. We are live actually over on ttradio.org right now for the Late Late Show. So if you want to listen to that, pop over there. Just click listen live on the TT Radio website. I'd like to thank every single person for tuning in. This will be available as a podcast, probably tomorrow morning. So if you follow Teachers Talk Radio on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of those, listen to it, pass it on, press the copy button, press the paste on WhatsApp. I actually found out that 35% of listeners on Spotify for Teachers Talk Radio share a show via WhatsApp. I thought that was a very interesting statistic. I never imagined that number of people would share on a show via WhatsApp, but that's what people seem to be doing according to those statistics. So thank you ever so much, and we will be back again very soon. Well, we're already on the other channel, but we will see you and speak to you again soon on TTR. Thanks everybody, and good night.
Nice one. Cheers, Tom.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.